Hello, everyone. Great to see many of you here again. My name is Joy Mikkel. For those who don't know me, I am the Senior Program Officer with Refugee Welcome Collective. I want to first welcome you to our Refugee Welcome Collective monthly webinars. In these sessions, we aim to bring you interesting and timely information, just like this very important webinar. Our monthly webinars are social learning spaces that are meant to be an opportunity for you as staff at the local and the national levels to share resources, best practices, challenges, lessons learned in the field. So we hope that you enjoy today's webinar, centering diversity, equity, inclusion, and case management. Just a little bit about us. Refugee Welcome Collective collaborates with partners to provide in-depth training programs, monthly learning sessions, resources, on-demand technical assistance for sponsors, resettlement agency staff, refugees paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and others to support quality community sponsorship programs across the United States. Just for housekeeping, everyone on today's webinar is going to be automatically muted. However, if you have any technical issues, please drop your question in the chat so we can assist you. If you have any questions during the session, please feel free to drop it in the chat. Our speaker is more than happy to address your questions toward the end of our webinar, where we're going to have a segment of Q&A for 15 minutes. Additionally, any resources, a recording of today's webinar will be sent out to everyone. And this brings us to our presenter for today, Isabel Darling, MSW Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Belonging, and Learning and Development with Upwardly Global. Thank you, Isabel, so much for being here today, and I will give it to you from here.
Thank you so much, Joy. Thank you to Refugee Welcome Center, and thank you all for being here. It is an interesting time to be giving this presentation. When Joy and I connected a couple of weeks ago, I was like, absolutely. And then all of a sudden, post-election, DEI has a whole new existence and presence. So I am really appreciative of your presence. I'm appreciative of the work that you do. And I'm grateful for this opportunity to share some insight and wisdom that hopefully will ground us in the work that we need to keep doing and also provide some sense of community in that you're not alone in some of the fear that we may be navigating together. So let's get to the first slide. Perfect. So our agenda, we'll go through some guiding principles. I'll share a little bit about some of the assumptions and grounded perspective that I have. We'll do a grounding activity, really dive into the historical context of DEI, immigration, policies that are impacting us today, some tools, wellness, and then looking towards the future. Next slide, please. So this is me. You can read more about my bio and the work that I've done, but I did want to share that I do have 20 years experience working with refugees and immigrants. I started as a volunteer at IRC. I've been a case manager. I've been a program monitor for ORR and a national TA provider. I currently work as Upwardly Global's Director of DEIB and Learning and Development. Yes, those are a lot of ampersands in a title. And I am also a wellness coach for immigrant and refugee leaders with my company called Milk and Honey. I'm coming to today with beliefs that you should be aware of. I am pro diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I believe that our current political situation makes us extremely vulnerable to do the work that we believe in and that we have been doing. I also believe that those that are voting for things like mass deportation, banning LGBTQ community members from rights, are experiencing hurt and pain, and that their experiences with potential inequities are blinding them from the connection between one another. I want you to be aware of this because this is where my belief system is rooted. And it's important when we do this work that we are grounded in understanding our own individual belief system. I also want to name that I still believe in the power of us and in the power that love will overcome fear. So some people say that I'm very flowery, I'm woo, all of those things. Absolutely. If you need more data and you need more context, please reach out to me afterwards. You'll have my contact information. Please pop questions into the chat. Grace and Joy will be answering questions and or finding themes so that I can answer them at the end. I will be talking fast because in this presentation, I basically have a whole curriculum. I have about 80 plus slides. This was not an easy topic to just pop in. the topic I've given, training I've given quite a bit, but not in our current context. And so I really wanted to root in and share some historical context to give us awareness as to what we're navigating. So let's look at our objectives. Next slide, please. So today, I hope that we enhance understanding of history of diversity, equity, and inclusion, that we identify actions that can be made to center DEI principles in client and colleague interactions, and that we deepen our understanding of policies impacting our work. Next slide, please. So our guiding principles, I believe in creating a brave space. I'm not a person who says a safe space because I don't know what's safe for you. What's safe for me may not be safe for you, but I ask for your bravery. Expect and presume welcome. You are welcome here. Please honor silence and confidentiality if you are sharing guidance and information about colleagues, clients, partners with others. Please do not give identifying information. I ask that you be present, you speak your truth, and let others speak theirs. Please do not need, please do, there is no need to defend anyone's existence. Everyone who is here deserves to exist and not have to defend that. You are responsible for your well-being. If you need to take a break, if you need to be multitasking, I ask that you honor your own well-being in that. And remember that no one knows everything, but together we know a lot. Honor time agreements, which is really on me, and turn judgment into wonder. If we find ourselves judging others' content, let's ask, what does that actually mean, and dive for deeper information. Remember that we are human, not perfect, and expect and accept continued learning. We have about really 40 minutes together today. We're not going to answer the world's problems, but hopefully we have a little bit more context and grounded understanding. Next slide, please. So speaking about grounding, usually I would say this towards the end, but the world is kind of going through it right now. I know that in my heart, I've been waking up, I've been having nightmares, I've been having dance parties, I've been experiencing the whole array of emotions. And so it has become an important practice of mine to root into what inspires me in the face of difficulties. So I'd love for you all to put into the chat something that is giving you a sense of inspiration today. I will give you about 30 seconds. Write it in the chat. If you don't want to write it, just bring it to the center of your mind of something that is inspiring you. Something I've been sharing recently is that a good friend of mine finished going through chemotherapy, and so far it has been going really well. And I'm just so proud of him and proud of the community that showed up for him during that time. So these are the things that I find really important to be able to ground ourselves while we are navigating difficult situations. Let's go to the next slide to maybe help give some inspiration. And then the next slide after this. One more slide. So I don't know if folks have been watching what's been going on in the Maori community in New Zealand, but seeing the Maori population come together, rise up, unified, and speak inside of Parliament, dancing and singing and communicating their ancestors' language, has really been a source of inspiration for me. And I really wanted to bring that to the forefront. Again, feel free to write into the chat things that are giving you inspiration. Sometimes it can be a child, can be hanging out by your favorite tree, good food. It really brought me a tremendous amount of joy seeing this. And then let's see, is there a slide right before this? Yes. So here are some quotes, and maybe these are speaking to you today, but I'll read them out loud and maybe something around that is calling to you. From Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., if we do not act, we will surely be dragged down the long, dark, and shameful corridors of time reserved for those who possess power without compassion, might without morality, and strength without sight. Or a quote that's really speaking to me from Horace Mann, a different world cannot be built by indifferent people. Margaret Mead's quote, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And if you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. So, if any of these are speaking to you today, hold them close to your heart. Use them as a source of light and inspiration as we continue to do this work and dive a little bit deeper. Thank you to those that have shared. I see folks talking about gospel music, kids, the outlook and their perspective, nature, and the people. Thank you so much for that. All right, let's dive in. We're going to do some time traveling and look at the historical context, immigration in the US. Next slide, please. This is a quote from an author that I extremely admire, named Sean Ginwright. He has transformed the language of trauma-informed care to healing-centered. And he has this quote that really speaks to me. We see the world as us versus them, and it's hard not to. Our history and our lives remind us every day which groups we belong to and which groups we don't. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start with US immigration. It can feel a little bit overwhelming to wonder, how did we get here? This is new. This is new for America. Where is this anger, maybe some vitriol and even hatred coming from? And it's important to know that historically, this is not new at all. From the beginning of the foundation of America, meaning that colonizers came here from Europe and started a genocide against indigenous communities and then founded what we know as America today, actually started with a tremendous amount of racism. If we look at only 14 years after the founding of this country, the Naturalization Act was started, where it was about free white people of good character who have been living in the United States for 2 years or longer are able to apply for citizenship. Now we are looking at race and we're looking at judgment of personality and of character. So already from the beginning, we're looking at what it means to be a citizen and how race and personal judgment of political leaders are making that distinction. You then look down at the bottom to 1798, the Alien Enemies Act. Now, we're going to hear more about this because we're seeing that at the end of this timeline today. There was an anti-immigration bill in 1849, the Immigration Act that really focused on English literacy requirement. And in 1924, an American Immigration Act and the Johnson-Reed Act, which really created more prioritization of European immigrants and a strict non-white quota on Asian and Southeastern European nations. So we're already seeing that there is a preference and a racial component to the work that we have been rooted in doing. And we may say, well, the populations we work with are different today. You're absolutely right. But the policies that existed hundreds of years ago are still impacting us today. We have the Immigration Act, where it really did lift up the quota system and start to bring in more folks, but that didn't decrease prejudice and racism that correlated. And then, as we know, in 2017, with Trump's first administration, starting in 2016, he enacted the Muslim travel ban. And now today, there's a proposed Alien Enemies Act, which will encourage a mass deportation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide, please. I wanted to root in to the amendment, the 14th Amendment, of all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the U.S. and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Now, on the right, I have a quote from an activist that's talking about how what is written and what is true in reality is different. So every single time the police shoot another unarmed Black or brown or indigenous person, every single time an LGBTQ plus person is fired from their job or left houseless, every time immigrants are stripped of their rights, that should belong to them. We are experiencing the gap between what is written and what is true. It is essential that we understand US law right now. It is essential that we understand the facts of what the founding of this country was supposed to be built on, because there are going to be moments in the very near future where we are told something different. And I need you all, as my colleagues, as my fellow activists, as my fellow advocates for our own families, for our communities, to know that this is not the intention of what our Constitution was about. Let's go to the next slide where we dive a little deeper into DEI. So diversity, equity, inclusion, we'll talk about affirmative action, but I also want to recognize that this might have included bridge programs in colleges, social services, civil rights movements, and even a term that you may have heard of critical race theory. Next slide, please. So going into our history again, now DEI has been in the news recently, and it can sound like something new, but in actuality, this came from the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. And it actually came from Lyndon B. Johnson and leaders in our community that were saying, you do not need to take a man who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him to the starting line of a race, saying you are free to compete with all the others and still justify a belief you have in that being completely fair. Now, this is recognizing that Black Americans, African Americans, post-slavery still did not have equal rights. And the expectation was that Black Americans were going to be able to achieve the same as every other US citizen. How is that possible when for 100 years they were not able to vote, they were not seen as human, and they were not able to build their own communities without the risk of them being burned down or taken away? So the reality was people were starting at a different starting line. Now, this was very focused on Black Americans and women as well. And so when DEI, or diversity, equity, inclusion, started, it really was around affirmative action and making sure that people had access to workplaces and work opportunities, and that their skill sets were seen and not used as a prejudice against them. So in 1964, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 started, prohibits employment discrimination on the grounds of race, religion, sex, or national origin, and it applies to all employers. And then it also fed into universities, public or private, that have at least 15 employees, but it was also about the admissions program. In the 1970s, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission was started to help enforce laws to prevent workplace discrimination, because just because you bring people to the table does not mean that discrimination will be reduced. 1973, there was a Vocational Rehab Act, and this was really focusing on federal contractors recognizing using affirmative action as a way of ensuring that people with disabilities were also included into the workplace. In 1990, the words multiculturalism, globalization, intersectionality started to show up because companies started to realize the diversity of staff actually enhanced productivity and actually enhanced efficiency of the work, and how necessary that was. Also, before that, in 1974, there was a movement to ensure that veterans who had returned from war had an opportunity to be in the workplace as well. So I really root my understanding around DEI in the fact that this is about access. This is about building bridges so that people have the opportunity to bridge the gap of differentiation and a lack of equitable services that existed before. And this was an opportunity to bridge that gap. In 2014, there were measures put into place by President Obama to make sure that we were looking at equal pay for women. Next slide, please. So a timeline of portrait of federal workplace protections. It's important to know that in 1938, there was a Fair Labor Standards Act, Equal Pay Act in the 60s. There was also an act of making sure that we were protecting young people in the workplace, Occupational Safety and Health Act, the Civil Rights Act, as I mentioned. And then if you look at 2010 onward, there's still a fight for equal rights for LGBTQ plus population. And so that's really important to know. Of it actually hasn't made its way to everyone. And so when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, this is not about taking someone who is not qualified and putting them into a role. It is making sure that folks who have access and have skill sets of equal capacity have the access to a position and a job that they may not have been given prior to that. And so a lot of times you may hear DEI actually stands for didn't earn it, which is wild to me when you consider some of the folks that are being appointed to the new administration who don't actually have any background in the roles that they're being appointed to. In my mind, DEI is actually working for them, of giving them an opportunity that they don't deserve if they're using their own definition. So it's important to know that people are still fighting for equal rights, haven't been able to access them, and DEI is a way of rooting that in. Now, when we think about our own work working with refugees and immigrants, we're also advocating to make sure that we are building bridges for their opportunity to have access as well. Next slide, please. So this is a quote again from Lyndon B. Johnson. We seek not just freedom, but opportunity. We seek not just legal equity, but human ability, not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and equality as a result. And this was a president of the United States envisioning what a great society would be. And this was a speech that was given to the HBCU, Historically Black Community College, Howard University, saying his commitment to affirmative action, making sure that African Americans had access to jobs like everyone else. Next slide, please. So again, affirmative action. After Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968, you saw an uptick, very similar to when George Floyd was murdered. You saw an uptick of commitment of diversity, equity, inclusion efforts in nonprofits as well as corporations. After MLK's murder, Harvard, Princeton colleges started to increase their effort to ensure that communities had access to getting into the college, that there were not more obstacles in their path than there were for others, and that the pathway opened up, which actually increased their enrollment by 76%, where 1,200 freshmen were enrolled into Harvard, for example, and 90 were actually African American. So not even huge numbers, but still what an increase and an improvement. Clinton administration also enhancing affirmative action, making that deepened commitment. And then we saw in 2022 that there was a trial, the Students for Fair Admissions versus President and Fellows of Harvard College. And Harvard College and UNC students actually came together and said, it's not fair that certain students are able to access college and get admitted over other students. And so the Supreme Court ruled that affirmative action in a college setting was unfair, unjust, and against our Civil Rights Act, which then decreased and put colleges in a position to have to decrease their admissions of communities of color, of those that have experienced oppression, and those that have been historically marginalized. Now, my perspective on this is that people believed that we finally reached equity and that we no longer needed affirmative action. And so why would we make sure that we were filling a quota? And the perception then kind of got what I perceived to be twisted, in that they believed that people were not qualified to be accepted, but were being accepted over whites that were qualified. This is not accurate information, and this became a source and foundation of misinformation that has put us into our current situation. So again, affirmative action was built to help build bridges between disenfranchised communities, historically marginalized communities for generations, to help bridge that gap, to try to get people to the same starting point. And now we have reduced that due to a belief that we had achieved that. And in actuality, the numbers still showed that women were not making the same amount as men. LGBTQ plus community members did not have equal pay or even access to jobs, having the same rights of being able to get married. All of these things indicate that we are not in an equal setting. So therefore, these programs would have still been beneficial. Let's go to the next slide. This is from JFK, John F. Kennedy, also a president. Take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed and that employees are treated during employment without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin. Now, this I do believe contributed a little bit to what we know as being colorblind of let's not look at their identity. And in actuality, I think it's essential to look at our identities because there's wisdom and information and insight that comes with it, but we do not want to be judging based on that. Next slide. So let's look at our current context and do a vocabulary check. Let's jump to 2 slides. And this is coming from the Department of Labor. It looks like some of the content didn't transfer over, but from the Department of Labor, which is a government-funded entity, they're recognizing that diversity includes physical attributes, appearance, abilities, education background, family background, nationality, marital status, class, religion, ethnicity, age, gender. Everything about us makes our diversity and our identity and who we are. It is essential that we recognize that our visible outward distinctions might be frequently mentioned, but it is not the only form of diversity that exists, but it is something that contributes and can be these man-made categories that creates an us versus them dynamic. Let's look at the next slide. Another definition by the Department of Labor. Why does diversity matter? Diversity at work affects how well people do their jobs, how creative we are, how much they get the job done, and it makes us feel that we fit more, making the workplace more positive and getting people more involved. Next slide, please. So what is equity? Now, hopefully many of you have already seen this image where the reality of what is equity is that someone has more than others. Some folks have less. So if you're trying to see over a fence and you are down in the ground, you're not only going to be able to not see it, but you have to climb above and find other resources to get there where other people may be seeing way above and have more resources than necessary. Now, equality is that everyone has the same amount, but equity is recognizing what is it that that particular person or that group might need. A person who is not able to see over the fence due to their size might need 2 barrels to be able to stand on, whereas someone else might only need one. That is the vision of what equity is to honor what is needed and recognizing that not all are going to be afforded the same opportunities, and therefore we have to work to address the imbalances between us. Next slide. So when we talk about inclusion, it is very different than, let's say, integration. When I first started working with refugees and immigrants, the language was assimilation, right? We're trying to get folks to come into the country and assimilate, become American, look like everyone and talk like everyone else, which meant white American, which meant that I was already set up to fail. Right? For those that are coming in from, let's say, African countries, or my family members coming in from Jamaica, we're not going to look and sound like everyone else. And then the terminology changed to integration. Well, you're allowed in this space, but you're still going to be treated separately and differently. The goal is inclusion. The goal is that we're all here with our differences, operating together and in contributing our unique perspectives and diverse perspectives together. Next slide, please. Now, this is a model that I really do like of the order of which things can kind of go. Diversity, inclusion, equity is one, but when we add the term belonging, there's a difference there. Now, the concept is diversity is you've been asked to the party, right? Someone else is hosting, you've been asked to attend. Belonging is that you feel welcomed and comfortable going to the party. Inclusion is that you've been asked to help plan the party. And equity redefines what the party entails, who has the power to plan the party, and if there should even be a party. Now, I recognize that in nonprofit, in the work that we do, in survival mode, we don't always have time to go through all of these questions, but it's necessary that we know what the goal is. And when there is time to make that decision, that we honor that, that we lean into that, and that if the least we can do is aim for belonging. Diversity is not enough. Just having people at the table is not enough, but making sure that folks feel that they belong and have the capacity to contribute and be included. And the ultimate goal is to build an environment that is equitable, which in resettlement terms also means, are we including our clients in the decisions that we are making? Are we ensuring that we are seeing them as subject matter experts in their own lives and decision making? Next slide, please. So what are some of the risks to building a sense of belonging? Next slide. Microaggressions. I know that for myself, being a woman of color in this work, I've experienced quite a bit of them. I've experienced things that have a sexual undertone. I've experienced assumptions that I'm not as intelligent as I have degrees to prove that I am. These are examples of microaggressions here of, let's see, the question of you were born here because the person might be wearing a hijab and does not appear to be of a particular citizenship. Why haven't you found a husband yet? You speak really good English for an immigrant. These are these micro elements that start to contribute and wear down at the sense of belonging that we might be experiencing. So think about how you might even carry your own biases and contribute microaggressions in your own way, and think about ways that you may have experienced microaggressions. Let's go to the next slide. Sometimes power dynamics, ooh, this slide did not transfer well. Sometimes power dynamics also play a role. As a case manager, you have a power dynamic over your client, and that you know more of the context and information than your client does. But how are you using that power dynamic is the real question. Sometimes power is invisible. Power can operate at different levels. You may have clients that came to the country speaking English. That is a power dynamic in comparison to someone who does not. Let's go to the next slide. Different forms of bias. We all have them. It's all present in our understanding of affinity bias. Oh my goodness, we went to the same college. I'm going to lean in because I believe that we have a shared perspective. Stereotyping of, ooh, I had a bad experience with this group of people once. I don't want to continue to work with them. And I'm going to ask this question. Please check in with yourself about this. Have you ever worked with a population where you said, oh, I really didn't want to work with this population today. I prefer working with this client from this particular group? That is a symptom of what I believe to be burnout, because we're losing perspective on our ability to give equitable services. We might say, oh, this person is coming from this country, they're going to be harder to work with, or this person is so much more appeasing, I'd rather work with them. Next slide, please. So what does this have to do with resettlement? I'm touching upon it a little bit, but let's look at the next slide of a quote from a client that ended up in Maine. Um, Oh, yep. Okay. We'll do this slide first. So from Welcoming America, welcoming is about equity, achieving the best and most fair results for everyone so that we can all prosper. To get there, we have to be proactive and engage in conversations with our community that are not always easy, but are crucially important. So we are in the business of welcoming. We are in the business of sustainability. We are in the business of building opportunity and bridges. So we need to understand what are the barriers to that. And let's look at the language that was used by a client. Next slide, please. Once I came here, I was so sad and disappointed to know that my American dream had been betrayed by the reality of America. I don't know about you, but this is a conversation I've had with many clients, especially those coming that may never have experienced racism in a US context before and what that looks like. And that disappointment as to worrying about our safety, worrying about being judged about our identity. I want to remind us all what the definition of a refugee is: someone who fears persecution based on social group membership. Therefore, if we are judging, if we are persecuting, if we are making others feel less than due to their social group membership, we are perpetuating the pathway to refugees. Now, this is my platform that I truly believe that within 5 years, Americans will become the new refugee. If you look at some of the human rights violations that are on the docket right now of laws against women, LGBTQ+, we know that fleeing for to be able to access rights is something that we see on a daily basis, and Americans are about to face that. Next slide, please. Also, how do we see and talk with volunteers, journalists, perspectives? This seems like a positive statement, but when you really break it down, Ukraine is a civilized nation of prosperous middle-class people who are not obviously refugees, but they look like any European family that you would live next door to. Now, this was stated by Al Jazeera, CBS News, New York Times, and then an apology had to be sent out because they realized that that is indicating that there is another group of refugees that looks a certain way and maybe should be perceived differently. So how we even talk to ourselves, to others, telling the story of refugee resettlement, we have to be extremely mindful that we're doing that honors equity and that honors that there are power dynamics even within the marginalized. Next slide, please. All right, let's get into some tools and approaches. Let's get to 2 slides where it says speak. Thank you. This is not reading that way either. All right, so the acronym is SPEAK. The idea is in order to avoid microaggressions and in order to address them, stop and take a breath. P for privacy. Instead of calling someone out in public, let's have a private conversation if you are bearing witness to someone that is exhibiting bias. Showing empathy and curiosity. I'd like to know more about your perspective on that, and why do you believe that? Asking, what was their intent? And then K is keep focused and make sure that you're focused on a change for the better. It's not about making people feel badly. It's not about punishing folks. It's about providing support and showing that you are an asset to be able to not just prevent microaggressions, but help people see the bias that might exist within them. Next slide. We can go to that next slide. Thank you. Empathy. Empathetic communication is always going to be a tool. Build trust and rapport, enhance your own understanding, have compassion, promoting inclusivity, deepen connection, have reflective and adaptive leadership opportunities, manage your own personal relationships, and managing your emotions. And I really want to lean in on this manage your emotions because for yourself, you need to be taking care of yourself in order to prevent burnout, which then can help reduce bias and reduce microaggressions. Next slide, please. We'll actually go to slide 45. So you'll get these slides focusing on trauma-informed. A lot of you know this language, but I really did want to lean into healing-centered language, which is around honoring the fact that we can focus in on what is healing-oriented instead of just the trauma. What does healing look like? What does health and wellness look like? Building on collective well-being and rather than just a clinical approach, and starts with empathy. Next slide. Let's see. We can actually go down to 47. So looking at, are your relationships transactional or transformative? In our work with our clients, we want to remain transformative in the work that we do. Sometimes it has to be transactional. We're going to an apartment, we have to sign this paperwork, we need to communicate that. But how that gets communicated can be a transformative moment. We're limited, we're funded by the government. This is something that we need to do. Let's take the time to go through the paperwork so you understand it. All of a sudden, that's very different than sign this, sign this, sign this. I can't give you any services until you sign it. No, what are your questions? Talk to me about your concerns. I absolutely understand that. We need to show humanity in the work that we're doing, even when we are faced with some challenges. Joy, I want to let you know I see the time and we're going to make it happen. Let's go to the next slide. So let's look at some of our policies and what we're faced with today. We've talked about DEI, we've talked about the history, and here we are today of folks believing that DEI is actually going to be against Western civilization. One headline was, if we want Western civilization to survive, DEI cannot. We have quotes from, we can go to the next slide, from J.D. Vance saying that DEI is a destructive ideology that breeds hatred and racial division. It has no place in our federal government or anywhere else in our society. Next slide. Our current context is that the Supreme Court ruling of affirmative action really compelled not just colleges, but also companies to reevaluate their DEI initiatives out of fear of retribution and reprimand from the government and not being able to be funded. And so folks started to reduce DEI positions, started to reduce DEI initiatives, and started to no longer have a racial awareness in their hiring process, which then creates a new dynamic of racial inequities, LGBTQ plus inequities, and gender inequities, disability inequities, and inequities for veterans. Next slide, please. Now, I really want to lean into the Alien Enemies Act. It is not in motion yet, but this is an act that is proposed to initiate in 2025 with indiscriminate workplace raids, mass deportation and detention camps, and around-the-clock deportation flights. Now, where did this act come from? It actually came from the 18th century, and the last time it was used was during World War II for internment of Japanese, Italian, and German nationals out of fear that they were aligned with enemies during World War II. Let's look at the next slide. This is a slide of the young girl on the left is a Japanese American who was going into a detention camp. And the slide on the right are descendants of these folks that have been interned who are returning back to the land in California that of the detention camps and playing baseball, reclaiming positive memories from those moments. Our past influences our future. What happens for the next 4 years will have implications for generations to come, and we need to be prepared. Next slide. Random question to you. Any idea how much a mass deportation would cost the US in 1 year? Next slide. $88 billion annually. So this would include flights, this would include staff, this would include detention centers, $88 billion. Now, if we go to the next slide, American Immigration Council has alternatives of how we could invest that money. We could be building elementary schools. It's twice the annual budget for the National Institute of Health. It's 4 times the budget of NASA. We would be able to construct 2.9 million new homes in communities around the nation. Think about our clients that deserve homes and are seeking better housing. How do we want to be using this money? Next slide. Next slide. This is a frame from the movie The Joker 2 Jokers ago. He's talking to his social worker saying, I don't think you ever really hear me. And the social worker is sitting there saying they've cut our funding and we're closing down our offices. This to me is our current situation. How do we show up for others when we are worried about our own survival? We have to be aware that our stress is going to be contagious. And while we are doing this work, whether it's at our kitchen table or in our offices, we need to continue to do it with positivity and kindness. Next slide. The stress of my job was affecting me, including waking up every morning, having a hard time breathing as I was worried about specific clients coming from a case manager. Next slide. When we aren't sure how to act, we tend to do what we see others like us doing. Our perceptions of ourselves and how others perceive us affect our behavior. Meaning, if we are showing positivity and light, others will do the same. We can be a positive contagion. If we surround ourselves by negativity, we may also become negative. So we need to be each other's source of positivity. Let's go to slide 63. Next slide. Great. So I really want to encourage you all to do some contingency planning. Protecting staff and protecting colleagues as we are likely going to experience increased rates of bias, potential unemployment, LGBTQ plus bias and disrespect and discrimination. Our immigrant status, it makes us potentially vulnerable. Family members' immigration status. I encourage you all to support your staff members by increasing wellness resources, whether that's PTO, wellness days. If folks are experiencing bias, they may need some time to reframe. Upskilling and referral pathways. If unemployment is something that is potentially going to occur, how can we make sure that we can get access to other jobs? Ensure for staff members and clients that are LGBTQ plus that there's no reprimand for having flags, for showing pride. Discussing insurance access for family members of same-sex families. Will health insurance still be covered? Family members' immigration status. If you need to go to court to support your family members or yourself, will there be increased PTO and honoring to be able to do that? We need to make these plans and put them into place. Let's go down to slide 66. It is important that we recognize that our work is the potential of building a sanctuary for our time with our clients. What does it mean to maybe change the light bulbs if they are zapping and tinning? What does it mean to vacuum your floor? What does it mean to bring a plant in when you're doing a home visit? These are practices that can remind people that we are human, even while we are facing really difficult challenges. I have some resources of how do we redesign resettlement through honesty, boundary setting, and flexibility. We're going to skip that, but again, you will have access to that. So let's go down to slide 70 where we are centering hope. I want to make it really clear that there are amazing movements in motion that are countering what might be perceived as really difficult times right now. So there's the SHIELD Act. The SHIELD Act stands for Safe Harbor for Employees to Inspire Lasting Development. It's legislation in the US that focuses on protecting immigrant workers from exploitation and retaliation of employees. The Fairness to Freedom Act is to ensure that immigrants have access to legal rights. This has not been supported yet, but it is on the table. But please know that people are fighting for us. Next slide. Since 1946, the American Immigration Lawyers Association has existed, and they are training lawyers on how to know what immigration law needs and what they need to be aware of. We need to know the law better than any time that we ever had right now because the law is being flipped on its head. And so we need to be partnering with our community lawyers to know what that work is. Next slide. ACLU is actually suing Trump to get details on what a mass deportation would look like. ACLU is advocating for us and making sure that they know how to prepare us and put us in a good position. Next slide. This is a framework that I've created, welcome framework. Make sure that you are warm and inclusive in your communication, regardless of what is happening. Embrace intersectionality of identities, recognizing if you are coming into this country and you have a disability, in addition to being a refugee, you're going to experience different types of hardship that need that recognition. L, learn and reflect continuously. It is on us to be educated and be informed. Cultivate self-care and resilience. We cannot pour from an open cup. We have to, from an empty cup, we have to be able to pour into ourselves and believe in something better. Offer practice tools and resources to one another. Measure and adjust for impact. Offer surveys. Find out what we can be doing better and adjust. And then, of course, empower our community connections. There are other amazing resources out there. Let's go down to slide 78. Curious about the actions that you will take. Next slide. What actions will you take? And this can be as a small pivot of research, acts of kindness, meditation practice for yourself, sharing a song of inspiration or a playlist in your organization, teaching a young person about an activist so that this upcoming generation knows the work that came before them and is continuously committed to doing the work moving forward. Next slide, please. Act as if what you do matters and makes a difference because it does. Next slide. I had the opportunity to listen to Angela Davis, who was a former Black Panther, was excommunicated from the United States, was able to come back after having to be in Cuba for 20 years, and is now allowed back in the United States. And she was holding a session last week in Oakland, California, around the power of love and community. And someone asked the question, what if I'm tired? And she said, if we are tackling this as an individual, it is impossible. We must think of ourselves as a collective. We are not individuals to carry the entire burden, but as a collective of beings, as interdependent beings. When some are tired and resting, others will keep going. So please know if you need to rest, rest. There are others doing the work. And then when you have rested, continue so that those doing the work can rest themselves. Next and last slide. This was also shared at that talk. Hope is a discipline. It's not something you just wake up having. You have to practice it as though you're going to the gym. You have to practice it like you are brushing your teeth 2 times a day. It is a practice that you have to constantly enact. It is a muscle that needs to be built. And for me, the only way to have hope is to lean into others that are doing this work and to remember that we are not new to this. We are true to this. This is not a new challenge for us. We have been facing this for hundreds of years, and we continue to rise. Next slide. This is my contact information. I would be honored to be in network and community with you. Please know that I will commit my life to making sure that your freedom exists because your freedom is tied up in mine, and I'm completely honored to call you all colleagues. I will pass it over to you, Joy, for final thoughts and Q&A.
Thank you so much, Isabella. I mean, this is just amazing. I love everything that you said, and I love the quotes so much. I'm planning to use these quotes as well. I'm gonna be right after this session, I'm gonna be sharing it with my colleagues. Well, now if you can just take a minute to tell us how this webinar went. Would love to hear your opinion. I would also love to get your suggestions for future webinars. So we ask you to just take one moment to scan this QR code and complete the survey, or you can use your phone to follow the link as well. So I'm gonna drop here the link for that. And while you guys are, oops, I think I did something by accident. I'm gonna share again. All right. All right, we're back. So here's the thing. Right, and while you are also giving your feedback, we're gonna ask if you could, yeah, we can just transition to Q&A time. So I'm gonna give it to you from here. So feel free to come off mute to ask your questions or drop your questions in the chat at this time. So Isabel, I think one thing that definitely always stands up to me when it comes to the difference between diversity and inclusion is being invited to the party versus being asked to plan the party. I love that so much. And I guess something that came to mind right away is we know that our case managers right now are struggling with all of these emotions. I love how you mentioned to keep that hope, to work on that hope, and to work together as a community. What are some practical things that when they wake up in the morning, they can get to do? to set them for the day. Every day, it may get heavier and heavier as January 20th comes closer. Yeah.
Absolutely. And this really goes into a little bit more of a combination of self-care and activism. And that looks different for everyone, right? My partner, he loves music. He will get up and he will actually go to his DJ set. It's not what he does for his job, but he has a DJ set and he will make mixes and just set him in the right zone for the day. Talking to family members and young people and asking them questions to engage in their thoughts and perspectives. For me, I might do a yoga flow, right, and be grounded. But I know that that is really hard to do. To sit down and meditate when my heart is hurting, when I'm listening to the news even before the elections came about, the world is going through it and has been going through it. So how do we hold the hurt and hold hope at the same time? That is going to have to be a personal conversation that you have. But I ask you to take the time, and maybe you take time in your next staff meeting of what does a wellness toolkit look for you as an individual, and what does it look like in the workplace? Having contingency plans so that you know if something were to shift, you have things in motion. And for those of you that are refugees that have an immigrant refugee background, I know that some of you know this all too well, how important it is to be prepared. What does it mean to have access to the paperwork that you need in case you need to leave and flee? We may not be in that situation in the US right now, but what does it mean if we do have to go through a shift in who has a job right now? Have you updated your resume? Have you built in your network? Have you networked with colleagues within the field? Are there skills that you could learn from one another to be able to enhance and increase your capacity to do the work? Are there places that you'll be able to continue to volunteer? It's also really important to know what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do. Some people may say, come to this protest with me. And you may say, I only have a TPS right now. My status would make me a little bit vulnerable to be able to be out in the streets in case something were to happen. I can't do that. Have your boundaries very clear so that you know what you can and cannot do. I would also say that leaning into supervisors, and for supervisors on this call, a heavier burden is going to be on us. Typically, when I give this presentation, we're not in a current zone where things are about to shift, where we're worried about planes that are owned by ICE coming into the workplace. I've never had to give a presentation under this context before. And so I am going to lean into the honest reality that we have to accept that this is going to be harder on us than it has been in the past. So that honesty has to be a reality. And we also have to remember that we have never been the only answer for our clients. Our clients got in front of us because they have leadership skills about them as well. So work with them. They are community members. They're not just clients to check off a box for ORR. We don't even know what the state of ORR will be, but the work is going to continue, and it's going to continue with or without the paperwork. So I'd say lean in with your staff, figure out what your contingency plans are, what's the messaging, and to be a little bit cheesy, that quote of look for the helpers. There are helpers everywhere. People will be looking to you because you are a helper, but providers need providing for too. So come up with that plan for yourself, identify who your helpers are, connect with your colleagues. This is going to be our community for 4 years, needing to navigate some of these dynamics and lean into law, continue to upskill and educate yourself.
Thank you so much, Isabel. I know we are at time. I drop the link for the feedback. So please just take a minute to complete the survey. And thanks again to our presenter, Isabel. That has been awesome. Very informative webinar. I'm getting all of these feedback here, even in the chat. So thank you so much for your time and your expertise that you have shared with us today. And thank you everyone for attending today's RWC monthly webinar. And we will see you next month.
Thank you so much.